Have you ever stopped to think about how Berlin was exactly 10 minutes before the wall fell? Not later, not during, but at that moment when no one yet knew that history was about to change. Today, thanks to artificial intelligence, we can recreate those last minutes, the mood on the streets, the eerie silence, the restless looks, the feeling that something was out of place. And as you watch this video, I want you to imagine that it's there, standing still, watching, feeling the weight of that moment. Because what you're going to see now isn't about the wall, it's about a city's last breath before everything changes. If you had been in Berlin that night, you might not notice anything right away. The streets were still lit, the buses continued their routes. Some people returned from work with their hands in their pockets because of the cold. Everything seemed normal, at least at first glance. But there was something strange in the air, a different silence, not the silence of the early morning, but that silence that arises when people speak less than usual, when the steps slow down, when the looks take a little longer than they should. Near the wall, the guards held their positions, firm posture, weapons hanging, faces closed. It was just another shift. At least that's what it should be. But that night, no one seemed really comfortable there. Some checked the clock frequently. Others watched the street on the other side for a few seconds longer than usual. On the civilian side, small groups began to form. There were no screams, there were no protests, just people standing still, waiting for what? No one would know how to answer, not even them. Conversations took place in low voices, short sentences, unanswered questions. Did you hear anything? They say something has changed. Maybe it's just a rumor. And that's how the tension begins, not with chaos, but with doubt. The city breathed, but in a heavy way, as if Berlin were holding the air in its lungs, as if everyone felt deep in their chests that this night would not end like the others. Nothing had happened yet. No order had been given. No gate had moved. But the heart of the city, it no longer beat at the same pace. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is this. At that moment, no one knew that they were living the last minutes of a divided Berlin. They just felt like something was about to break, even though they didn't know exactly what. Now, let me ask you a question. If you were there that night, listening to bits of information, loose phrases, rumors that no one confirmed, what would you do? Would you stay at home? Would you go to the street? Or would you just wait, hoping that someone would explain what was happening? Because that's exactly how it all started. There were no sirens. There was no clear official announcement. What existed was something much more dangerous. Poorly explained information. A sentence said too quickly, conveyed without details, without instructions, without responsibility for the impact it could cause. Some people heard it on the radio, others on television, others simply heard it from someone who had heard it from someone else. And when the news comes like this, it doesn't come with certainty, it comes with imagination. It seems that travel is allowed. They said that the wall can be crossed. Maybe it's now. Maybe. That word began to circulate through the streets of Berlin like a cold wind. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's just another empty promise. And while the citizens were trying to understand what was happening on the other side, the guards didn't know either. Think about it for a second. Armed men, trained to obey orders, now without any orders. No official statement, no clear link, just silence coming from above. Have you ever imagined the weight of this? On one side, people approaching with hope in their eyes. On the other, guards trying to decide if this was a historic moment or a trap. And here I want to ask you something really. Who do you think was more frightened that night? The citizens or the soldiers themselves? In my opinion, fear does not choose sides. Fear appears when no one knows who is in control. Every minute, more people arrived, not in noisy crowds, but in timid steps. People who came just to look, just to confirm, just to see if it was real. And the more people arrived, the harder it was to turn back. It's curious how history often doesn't start with courage. It starts with curiosity. One look, another approaches, another asks, and suddenly, without realizing it, a collective decision begins to form, even without anyone having authorized anything. Maybe you're thinking right now, but someone should have stopped it. Yes, should, but no one interrupts when no one knows exactly what's going on. And this is where that moment becomes so powerful and so human, because it wasn't a perfect plan. It was not a brilliant strategy. It was confusion. It was interpretation. It was silence. It was the moment when the information no longer belonged to the government, and it became the people's. And when that happens, there is no turning back. Berlin was still divided. The wall was still standing, but something invisible had already cracked, not the concrete, but the control. And perhaps that's what scares us the most when we look back. History did not change because someone ordered it. It began to change because no one could stop it. And as you listen to this now, you may notice something unsettling. No one that night was sure of anything, except one thing. Something was about to happen. At that point in the night, it was no longer possible to pretend that everything was normal. People kept arriving at the posts on the wall, not in the form of organized protest, not with posters or shouts, but in small groups, couples, friends, families, ordinary people who had heard something on the radio, seen something on television, or simply followed the movement of the street. Many could not explain exactly why they were there. They only knew that they needed to see it with their own eyes. The guards also realized this. The number of people increased slowly, but without aggressiveness. There was no confrontation. There were questions. There was insistence. There was expectation. On the eastern side, the soldiers had not received new orders. The phones didn't ring. The superiors did not appear. And the more time passed, the more evident it became that no one in that entire hierarchy was prepared for that scenario. This is not a supposition. This is recorded in the accounts of the time. The officers themselves years later would say that they were confused, insecure, trying to interpret something that had never been trained. They knew how to shoot. They knew how to control crowds, but they didn't know what to do when people just waited. The atmosphere was not one of rebellion. It was a silent decision. Some citizens asked for explanations, others only showed documents, others asked if they could really cross. The answer was never clear, because the guards didn't know either. And perhaps this is the most human detail of this whole story. No one there was sure of anything. There was no plan. There was no speech. There was no official guidance saying, do it. There were only people in front of people, men in uniform looking at civilians who could be there, neighbors, citizens looking at soldiers who seemed as lost as they were. The wall still existed physically, but emotionally, it no longer worked as it used to. The tension increased, not because someone shouted, but because time passed. And the more time passed, the harder it became to send everyone away pretending that nothing had happened. Some guards began to hesitate, others exchanged glances. Instead of orders, there was silence. Instead of authority, there was doubt. And that changes everything, because authoritarian systems work as long as no one hesitates. The moment someone stops to think, something starts to crumble, even if no one notices it at the time. On the civilian side, no one celebrated. There was still no joy. There was tension, a mixture of hope and fear. Many knew that something big was about to happen, but they had no idea how big it was. If you were there, you probably wouldn't understand either. He would probably be cold, tired, confusing, Maybe she just felt like she didn't want to leave before she knew what would happen. And so, without historical speeches, without epic scenes, without leaders at the forefront, Berlin reached the limit of that moment. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with ordinary people waiting for an answer that no one knew how to give. And when the story finally moved forward, minutes later, it wouldn't be because someone planned it. It would be because no one could hold on anymore. Sometimes history changes, without a fuss, just with ordinary people who decide not to back down. That night, Berlin didn't know what would come next, but he felt that nothing would be the same. And maybe that's what moves you the most. They weren't heroes. They were people like you and me. If you were there, would he have crossed or stood there waiting,